Welcome, everyone. My name is Micha Winkler-Thomas, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Harvard Art Museums, and I welcome you here for this lecture today. We are here today to celebrate the recent opening of the exhibition, the Salomon Collection, Dürer to Degas and Beyond, which honors a momentous gift of over 260 prints, drawings, paintings, and sculpture by the late Arthur K. and Marriott F. Salomon. The exhibition, curated by Cassandra Albinson, Marina Kliger, and Casey Kane Monahan, is on view on the third floor through August 17th and will be open tonight until 7 o'clock p.m. Please be sure to visit after the event. We are deeply grateful to Arthur and Marnie Salomon for their careful stewardship of these artworks over many years and for their generous impulse to share them with the Harvard Art Museums, a place in a community that was always near and dear to their hearts. Their extraordinary bequest continues the tradition of other transformative gifts of art to the museums, such as Paul Sachs, Grenville L. Winthrop, and Maurice Wertheim. The Salomons' remarkable collection was assembled over the course of 7 decades and spans more than 6 centuries. This evening's roundtable will focus in on a specific moment from this expansive trajectory, the late 20th century abstract art that they began collecting in the mid-1970s. In particular, we are honored to be in conversation with 2 longtime Boston area artists, Marjorie Minkin and Peter Lipsitt, whose artwork you can see in the exhibition upstairs. It is also our pleasure to welcome art critic, curator, and scholar Karen Wilkin, whose longtime engagement with Marjorie and Peter's work, as well as her extensive, often direct knowledge of many of the other artists in the Salomons collection, will immeasurably enrich the discussion. Before we dive in, I have a few additional notes of thanks. The Salomon Collection, Dürer to Degas and Beyond, is made possible through the generosity of Arthur K. and Marriott F. Salomon, whose extraordinary bequest demonstrates their deep commitment to the study of art. Support for this exhibition is provided by the Arthur K. and Marriott F. Salomon Care of the Collection Endowment Fund, the Marriott F. Salomon Care of Collections Fund, and the Martha Tedeschi Exhibition Fund, made possible by the Lunder Foundation, Peter and Paula Lunder family. And a special thanks to Mitra Abaspor, Houghton Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art and Head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art, for advising on tonight's program. And to Megan Grady, Tiana Fincher, Sarah Hagland, and our colleagues in Visitor Services for making it happen. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Marina Kliger, the Rousseau Curatorial Fellow in European Art and one of the curators of the exhibition, to the podium. Welcome.
Thank you, Micha, for that lovely welcome, and thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Marina Kliger. As Micha said, I'm the Rousseau Curatorial Fellow in European Art here at the museums. It's been my great pleasure to learn about Arthur and Marnie Salomon and their incredible collection over the past 2.5 years. Many people at the museums, however, have known them for much longer than that, and even more people were involved in the arduous process of cataloging, transporting, and researching the collection after Marnie's passing in 2020. I want to thank everyone who made that transformative acquisition possible, and I'm especially grateful to my co-curators, Cassandra Albinson and Casey Kane Monahan, for laying the groundwork for this exhibition and for trusting me, another specialist in 19th century European art, to tell the Salomons' story of collecting contemporary American art in the late 20th century. A brief note about the order of events tonight. Each of our roundtable participants will give a short presentation here at the podium, after which we will all sit down. We'll sit down and have a conversation. I'm going to start us off with an introduction to the Solomons and their collection, and I will then introduce each of the speakers before inviting them to come up to the podium themselves. So, Arthur and Marnie Solomon promised their collection to the Harvard Art Museums in 1985. They had formed strong ties with the university, its fine arts department, and the Fogg Museum decades earlier, however. Arthur pursued doctoral studies in chemistry here from 1934 to 37, during which time he audited a number of art history courses. After World War II, he returned to teach at Harvard Medical School, where he was a professor of biophysics until the 1980s. Marnie received her BA in art history in 1958 from Radcliffe, where she also pursued at least a year of graduate study. And she later worked as a teaching fellow for various Harvard professors. When they met in the late 1960s, both were already serious collectors. Arthur focused on 19th and early 20th century European art, while Marnie was a dedicated print collector. However, after they married in December 1972, the Solomons experienced what they would come to describe as a contemporary awakening. They began buying the art of their own time, focusing particularly on American abstraction. The catalyst for this dramatic shift in focus was a man by the name of Kenworth Moffett, a friend of Marnie's since the 1960s, as well as the first curator of contemporary art at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. Moffett was hired in the spring of 1971 on the heels of major changes at the MFA and in the city's art scene more broadly. In the 1960s, Boston had less than a dozen galleries showing works by living and only rarely young local artists. The situation became particularly bleak in summer 1968 when the Institute of Contemporary Art was evicted from its longtime venue on Newbury Street. Meanwhile, new trustees at the MFA, including George Sebald and Lewis Cabot, called for their older institution to modernize its financial, curatorial, and programming practices, and recommended, with no immediate effect, the establishment of a contemporary art department. The following year, a group of Boston artists took matters into their own hands and formed the Studio Coalition to host the city's first open studios. For the MFA, things came to a head when in 1970, 4 seasoned Boston gallerists, Portia Harkis, Barbara Krakow, Phyllis Rosen, and Joan Stoneman, opened Parker Street 470, a new exhibition space for large-scale painting and sculpture right across the tracks from the MFA. A year later, artists meeting in that space formed the Boston Visual Arts Union, an advocacy organization that directly criticized the venerable institution across the street for its indifference to contemporary art. So Moffett's arrival in 1971 at the MFA was greeted with fanfare. A well-respected and well-liked professor at Wellesley College, Moffett had earned his PhD here at Harvard, where he was one of a group of students who came under the sway of influential art critic Clement Greenberg in the early 1960s. Earlier in the 40s and 50s, Greenberg had famously championed abstract expressionism as the apex of an evolution of form from Manet to Cézanne to Picasso to Jackson Pollock. In the next decade, Greenberg turned his attention to younger artists working in this modernist tradition, like Helen Frankenthaler, Morris Louis, Kenneth Noland, and Jules Olitsky. Artists who rejected painterliness for a new openness and clarity of color, a tendency he termed post-painterly abstraction, or now known more commonly as color field painting. It was these artists whom Moffett promoted as a critic, scholar, and curator. As an aside, in 1965, while still a graduate student at Harvard, Michael Fried had organized the exhibition Three American Painters, Noland, Olitsky, and Stella, here at the Fogg Museum, which had established the taste for color-field painting in Boston. Though Arthur and Marnie must have seen this exhibition, we have no record of what they thought about it, about its featured artists at that time. But we do know that Moffett was instrumental in shaping the Solomons' taste in contemporary art. The couple were founding members of the visiting committee for Moffett's new Department of Contemporary Art at the MFA, and even met Clement Greenberg in the spring of 1972 when he was in town for his protege's second exhibition at the MFA, a group show entitled Abstract Painting in the 1970s. Quote, "I still remember with interest our talk at dinner," end quote, Arthur wrote months later in a letter to Greenberg that came to us with the Solomons collection and is on display in the archival materials upstairs with a number of other really fascinating documents. Of the 12 artists featured in that 1972 exhibition, the Solomons eventually purchased paintings by 5 of them, as well as works on paper by 2 others. Through Moffett, they developed a close working relationship with New York gallerist Andre Emmerich, and for nearly a decade, they bought 2 to 6 works from him every year by leading color field painters, including Noland, Olitsky, Jack Bush, and Larry Poons. The very first contemporary works to enter the Solomons collection, however, were by sculptors. In 1974, they bought a 10-ton, 10-foot-long steel sculpture by Michael Steiner called Botanica, though acquired, which you see on the left here. Though acquired from New York's Marlborough Gallery, the work was delivered directly from the MFA, where an exhibition devoted to the young sculptor had just closed, and you see an installation view here on the left. Arthur later recalled that he and Marnie, quote, "went and crawled around it in the museum," end quote. 2 years later, they acquired another large steel sculpture, this time by British sculptor Anthony Caro, on the right there. Though purchased in London, this acquisition too came on the heels of an exhibition at the MFA, the 1975 Caro retrospective organized in Boston by Moffett. In contrast to the museum's white box galleries, which echoed the sculpture's hard edges and smooth, flat surfaces, the Solomons installed their new acquisitions in their spacious yard at 27 Craigie Street here in Cambridge, where the sculptures weathered years of New England winters and became part of the Solomons' lives. Their smaller 2- and 3-dimensional works lived inside their large, early 19th century Italianate revival home, where contemporary works shared wall and shelf space with old master prints, family photos, and books. By the early 1980s, however, as the Solomons began to buy large pictures, they found themselves in need of more space. They soon engaged a pioneering architect, Mary Otis Stevens, who was a friend and neighbor here in Cambridge, who converted the property's late 19th century carriage house into a soaring 2-story art gallery that could accommodate the dimensions of the Solomons' larger contemporary works. Rather than transforming the interior into a white box gallery, architect and clients alike preferred to preserve the integrity of the original structure, retaining original features like the tongue and groove pine boarding that covered the interior. The barn, as they came to call it, was completed in 1987 and seemed to be a natural capstone to the Solomons' contemporary art collecting, which had slowed dramatically after 1985 when the couple promised their multifaceted collection to the Harvard Art Museums. For the next 3 decades, works by established artists like Olitsky, Noland, and Caro found a home at 27 Craigie Street alongside old and modern European masters from Dürer to Degas, as our exhibition states. Scattered throughout the house, yard, and contemporary art barn were also artists who made their careers much closer to home, closer to the Solomon's home, that is. In the early 1980s, at the height of their contemporary art collecting, the Solomons were also buying art by a group of young painters and sculptors living in the Boston area, including Marjorie Minkin and Peter Lipsitt, who are here with us today, as well as Gerald Webster, Arthur Yanoff, Rana Conti, and Lucy Baker. This group of artists, some of whom you see pictured here, and Marjorie and Peter are all the way on the far left, they were loosely associated through studio visits organized by Ken Moffat, who you see in the center of the picture there with the white hair and glasses. These visits were sometimes attended by prominent practitioners of abstraction, like Jules Zalitsky and Anthony Caro, as well as supportive critics, like Karen Wilkin, who also joins us today. Karen has made her way back to the Boston area today to tell us more about this fascinating moment in the history of art and in the history of the Boston's art scene. And I am pleased to welcome her today. I will give a fulsome introduction now. Karen Wilkin is a New York-based critic, curator, and scholar. She has written monographs and organized exhibitions about many of the artists that the Solomons collected, including David Smith, Anthony Caro, Kenneth Noland, Jack Bush, and Helen Frankenthaler, as well as others like Stuart Davis, George Brock, and Hans Hoffman. She serves as the editor for art at the Hudson Review and is a regular contributor to the New Criterion, the Hopkins Review, and the Wall Street Journal. Karen was also chief curator of the Art Gallery of Alberta and a juror for the American Pavilion of the 2009 Venice Biennale. She has taught art history at the University of Toronto and currently teaches in the New York Studio School's MFA program. I look forward to seeing her current project, a Larry Poons retrospective, at the Buffalo AKG, which is formerly the Albright Knox Museum for those of us that weren't aware. That show is opening in March 2027. Please join me in welcoming Karen Wilkin.
Thank you. So, odd experience seeing that photograph because that's where I came in. What I propose to do is a kind of contextualizing of some of what's upstairs. When Ken Moffat arrived to create the contemporary department at the MFA, he organized a series of really quite remarkable shows, which I traveled from New York to see. Well, actually, I was living in Toronto then, so I traveled from Toronto, and many of the artists in New York would travel to see them, as well as the Boston area artists. So they were very influential and very exciting. The first one was a Jack Bush show, and Bush was someone who remained steadfastly in Toronto all of his life, but was much more recognized here than he was in Canada. He was collected by Americans in much more depth than Canadians until much later. Extraordinary, brilliant, color, vibrant paintings. These two are in the collection of the MFA, and they obviously had an impact on artists here. You've seen works by Gerald Webster, one of the young artists who, of course, saw this show. There was a remarkable show of works by the British sculptor Tim Scott, a series called Bird and Arras, which were made of colored plexiglass and steel tubing. The whole series was here. They have not been shown together since. That was 1972, that's a while ago. Some of them are in a private collection now in Toronto. Some of them belong to Lewis Cabot, who traded them with his friend David Mirvish in Toronto in exchange for having them restored. So they're all safe, but they're not all together. And these were extraordinary sculptures. I mean, they were made of materials that were atypical. As you can see, they're quite large, using color, and again, having a very, very strong impact, I think, more on painters than on sculptors at this point. The show that followed was a survey, if you like, a kind of miniature survey, with the ambitious title, Abstract Painting in the 1970s, which included such works as this very large, very powerful Motherwell open, that, again, this kind of resonance of the potency of color was very important to the younger artists. Big, very potent Morris Louis bronze veil, one of the few that isn't continuous. So this split is like a major event. Everything else is touching, and that isn't. These are all very large, very dramatic paintings, and were not previously shown in Boston to the extent that they were elsewhere. Andre Emmerich showed all of these people, but as you heard, the Boston gallerists were just getting going on this. This very vibrant Gottlieb was part of that exhibition. I could have spent the whole time just showing you works that were in this exhibition. So I've had to be very disciplined to not take up too much time. But it was a very, very high-level group of works. Now, Clement Greenberg was very involved in many of these exhibitions. He was a great champion of Kenworth Moffat, to the point where Clement Greenberg loved stirring up trouble. And he made a point of telling Michael Fried, who had been the fair-haired boy, how much better Ken Moffat was than Michael Fried. This, needless to say, did not create good feeling. And you can decide for yourself, looking at both careers, whether Clem was right or not. But at this time, he had put all his energy into helping Ken Moffat and trying to belittle Michael Fried. Didn't seem to hurt Michael Fried's career, but it wasn't pleasant at the time. Another brilliant exhibition was this Olitsky show, which was a major retrospective for the time, which also traveled. It was seen in New York and one other place that I'm forgetting. So this was not just a Boston Museum show. This was a national show showcasing an artist who was very new at the time and someone who people were paying attention to. The Solomons certainly paid attention to Olitsky. They became very good friends. There's a fine representation of work upstairs and even more that isn't on view. These paintings were very radical at the time, and you can see how, in some ways, this is seen as far as painting can go. Greenberg was always asked when he gave lectures if, since he thought that the irreducible quality of a painting was flatness, because illusionism belonged to the past, narrative belonged to literary concerns, that whether a flat surface covered with a single color would be a painting. And he always answered yes, but not necessarily a good one, which is fair enough. The painter Joseph Marioni, who is very well represented in the Foggs collection, used to say that the irreducible quality of painting was not flatness but color. Because if flatness was the only thing that was concerned, a person who could not see could understand a painting by touching it, but they wouldn't get the color. I think Olitsky would have agreed that the irreducible quality of painting was color. And you could say these paintings are flat surfaces covered with a almost single color. But they are very much about being confronted by a certain amount of that color with the edge drawing that tells you this is where the painting ends and this is where the world begins. So this ethereal, vast space is given a boundary, is turned into an object, contradicting the ethereal quality of the color. There was a wonderful show of Robert Motherwell collages that also was one that had, I think, remarkable resonance. They are some of Motherwell's most expressive works. Didn't seem to have had quite as much influence from what I can tell, but it was a terrific show, and I know a lot of people went to see it and liked it a lot. I certainly did. And proverbially, now for something completely different, Horacio Torres, who, if you know your art history, you know was the youngest son of Joaquim Torres Garcia, who was a Cubist-influenced kind of minimalist painter who had been in Europe for a long time, born in Uruguay, of Catalan parents, went back to Spain, ended up having worked with Aux Enfants and very much involved with Cercle Carré and all of these significant forum people, went back to Uruguay and started the Taller Torres Garcia, which was a kind of proto-Bauhaus. The idea was to abstract from the world. The painters started by making figurative work and then gradually found the abstraction in it. Horacio, the youngest son, learned how to do this very well, and at a certain point turned his back on it and decided he wanted to be Titian, and painted this extraordinary series of nudes. He died much too young, as you can see. He showed these to Greenberg. Greenberg suggested the audacious cropping. And in fact, it's that cropping that makes them so surprising and makes them look so contemporary. There are a few that he didn't crop, and they're well painted, but they don't have the impact of these. And this, again, was another very surprising show. This is contemporary art when this is a time when color field, minimalism, and pop are all coexisting. There wasn't a question of one beating out the other. They all seemed to be getting equal attention. Moffat was not interested in pop art. Greenberg was not interested in pop art. And they were interested in objects, so they were not interested in minimal conceptual art. But this was very different from the kind of a bold, abstract painting which the department was featuring. And then there was a major Caro retrospective, which was also seen at the Museum of Modern Art, which included such seminal works as Midday, which used to be in the garden of the Museum of Modern Art until they decided that they weren't going to show any interesting sculpture except the backs and the maillot. And then Orangerie, which used to belong to Kenneth Noland, And when Kenneth Nolan died, the Houston Museum leaped at the opportunity to acquire it. Two very important pieces from early Caro, and of course the show went right up to 1975. More about that later. So this was the kind of very ambitious exhibition that was being seen. And then, of course, if you happen to walk by the Shawmut Bank, there was this 57-foot long Friedel Zubas. Zubas was one of the most extraordinary painters in terms of being able to make sketches this big, which littered the floor of the studio, from which he would make 8-foot, 12-foot, 15-foot, and sometimes 57-foot paintings, with this kind of operatic orchestration of colors. He had a trapeze hanging in the studio, and I always had this image of him hanging upside down and brushing, which is clearly not true, fantasy on my part, but it was the only thing that made sense of these gigantic paintings with these bold brushstrokes. So this was visible from the street. There was a Zubas painting, Zubas exhibition that Ken Moffat organized, but this extraordinary thing where you could walk by it and look in the window and see it. Then it disappeared behind a false wall, and nobody knew what happened to it until a woman named Patricia Louie, who was researching Zubas, found it. And now it belongs to an amazing collection in Toronto, which happens to have a wall big enough to hang it. I just saw it a couple of weeks ago. It looks great. The other really influential show was a Larry Poons show in 1981. And that I know Greenberg was very, very involved with. It included this 25-foot long painting, Railroad Horse, which was the first of Larry Poons' so-called throw paintings. He'd made his reputation for what are known as the dot paintings that you all know, with the little vibrating ovals of color. And he discovered, which were very carefully plotted out. He decided he couldn't draw. He had to do all kinds of planning. Not that he wasn't allowed to draw, that he felt he was not able to draw. He discovered that the only thing he was really interested in was putting on the color. So he started pouring color, and then he started throwing color. And it is one of the mysteries that makes you believe in sheer, unadulterated talent, that these paintings made by throwing paint at the wall, of course he's orchestrating what he's putting into the bucket, why they end up as expressive, beautiful paintings and not as a complete disaster, there's no explanation for it. It's just Poons' will. This was also in the abstract painting show that I showed you earlier, but it was a feature of the show, the Poons retrospective, or at the time retrospective, and it still belongs to the Boston MFA, which never shows it, and I hope they will lend it to my retrospective, because if they don't, Larry will take out a contract on me. These works were also in the show, this enormous range of vibrating color, and he's letting gravity do the drawing for him. And then he starts interrupting the surface to change the flow. There's a wonderful example of that. There's a beautiful throw painting in the Solomon collection, and a wonderful example of one of the ones with a lot of stuff on the surface. There was another very exciting Caro show, an installation of what are called the York pieces. These were a series of sculptures made on the grounds of York University in Toronto. The largest pieces that Caro was able to make at that time. It was the first time he had heavy equipment and assistants, and it's as though he just fell in love with steel and held it up for us to admire it. This was installed on the grounds of the Christian Science Center outdoor show. Very, very beautiful. No color photographs of it, however, that I have. And of course, all of this had an effect on the younger artists who were in Boston at the time, whom I used to visit. I'm not showing you all of them because I have lost touch with some of them, but someone I am still in touch with is Sandy Sloan. This is an early work. The MFA owns a painting of this series. They don't see fit to reproduce it in color on their website, but it's very much like this. This is a recent painting. She was using a push broom for overscaled drawing, as many artists were. Olitsky was using a push broom as well as a spray gun. They were all finding ways of putting paint on that wasn't conventional. And she's gone back recently to using a push broom again. Rona Conti, who is also an internationally acclaimed calligrapher, and a very fine painter who is also part of this group, whom I used to visit. Jill Nathanson, who used to have a studio next door to Friedel Zubas. And this is a recent painting of hers. She's getting quite a lot of attention, and a museum show coming up. So these are people who have developed, grown, still relating to their roots in what you might call a color field tradition, but moving abstraction into new territory. And Jelaine Jones, who was a student at the museum school at the time that all this was going on, working in clay, and had just had last year a show in New York that attracted an enormous amount of attention, which we were all thrilled about because we've been fans for a long time and nobody was paying attention. So she is still using clay in some of her works, or concrete. So she too was very affected by this. Now this is just a tasting menu. This is in no way a complete account of what Ken Moffat showed or the artists who were who were responding to this. However, we have two of the artists who were responding to this right here who are going to tell you more about their response, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
I have the pleasure of welcoming Marjorie Minkin to the podium. Marjorie was born right here in Cambridge and continues to live and work in the Boston area. She earned a BA from Skidmore College in philosophy with a minor in studio art, followed by a master's degree in philosophy at Boston University. Later, she attended the museum school, earning a fourth-year diploma and a fifth-year certificate. Her work has been featured in over 80 solo and group exhibitions in the United States, Europe, and South Korea. Her paintings are in public collections, including the MFA Boston, the Flint Institute of the Arts, the Fort Lauderdale Museum of Art, and the National Gallery of Prague, as well as numerous private collections across the US, Canada, Brazil, Europe, Australia, South Korea, and India. Please join me in welcoming Marjorie Minkin.
I'd like to thank first Marina Kliger, Cassandra Albertson, Casey Moynihan, and Megan Grady for making this possible, for giving me the opportunity to show more of my work. Okay. So the painting on the left is a work on paper, acrylic on paper, and it's the work in the exhibition. I utilized many non-traditional tools to apply the paint, And this painting I see as a precursor of all my work to come. It's called Kenai 2. It was inspired by the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, with the evergreen forest on one side of the river. I love nature, it influenced my work, but I did not want to paint landscapes. I wanted to work abstractly so I could discover through my process my feelings, memories, and emotions influenced by landscape. So there's a kind of motion diagonal to the piece to suggest motion. Now the painting, and by the way, this was using some of the new polymer acrylic gels, which had been recently developed. So the painting on the right is called Southwest Sunset. It's a canvas where I applied the acrylic saturated into an untreated canvas and overlaid the canvas with acrylic polymers using various tools. And if I can, if I can figure out this one. Well, in the top area, about a third to a half of the way down, I tried to use some clear polymer gels so that you could see through the canvas, that layer, to what was underneath the surface. And unfortunately, the recently developed acrylic polymers didn't dry perfectly clear. They had a kind of a yellowish cast to them. So I then decided to just put some sheets of plastic over the canvas. I was always interested in layering, and I believe that our reality is multi-layered, and I wanted to express that in my work. So I decided to use polycarbonate. The brand name is Lexan, and this is a rather thin sheet which I heat welded onto the surface of the canvas, which was painted with iridescent mediums and pigments and gel. So the overlay, I just heat welded with an engineer's heat gun to attach it to the surface. And what happened is the forms created by the Lexan reflects light and also shadows onto the surface of the canvas. After doing many of those, most of which were painted beneath on the first layer and then painted with the overlay of Lexan, I realized, well, I don't have to just do these on canvas. The material itself could be a freestanding, a free hanging work. So the painting on the right is a large Lexan, which is 8 feet by 6 feet, 3 layers. The middle layer is a opaque deep blue with an overlay of the thinner material that I heat welded to the surface and then painted with some iridescent pinks and colors. And there's a layer closer to the wall, which helps project the piece away from the wall. And in person, you can see sort of a halo around the object when you experience it. Both of these works and all my work reflect my interest or inspiration from water and reflections on water. Having done these opaque works with Lexan, I thought, well, this is a translucent material. I should be using it translucently. So the work here on the left is called Through the Lens. It's a single-layered Lexan. It's heat-formed and then painted from the back in the channels created by the forming. And there's also some overlays of paint on the surface. So as you move around this piece, you see this, these different shadows and colors projected onto the wall and around the piece, the front, back, bottom, creating an interactive work. And one thing that's important to me is having my work be interactive. I want the viewer to be able to experience it by moving around the piece, seeing it from different angles. Well, I'm going to backtrack. So the piece on the left was made possible because I learned how to make Lexan rivets. Prior to that, I was doing opaque pieces and joining them with machine screws, which I would then cover up with acrylic mediums. But once I learned how to make Lexan rivets from Lexan rod, it freed me up to make multi-layered Lexan works, and the rivets just disappear visually when you see the work. So this work is 5 layers, and it changes color and shadows, reflections as you move around it. Then the piece on the right is a canvas influenced by the pouring that I did on the Lexan works. So there are various lighter areas applied with one tool and then pours on top, using a lot of iridescence, which isn't completely visible in this work. But as you move around the piece in person, it becomes very interactive. Now, the piece on the left is a Lexan work, multi-layered, that was hanging in an exhibition in 2023 in the Moakley Federal Courthouse in Boston. It was hanging in the Atrium Gallery, which is a 60-foot curved brick wall facing a 60-foot wall of windows, which looks out on sky and water. So from day to day, or actually from morning till night each day, the light would change on the works. And then from day to day, depending on the weather, the work would be constantly changing. The painting on the right also uses some of this interference color, especially in the middle area, which changes from pink to a whitish color, and it's just layered with many different applications of acrylics. This is a painting which, again, is utilizing some of the new materials and the iridescent interference colors, which change as you move from side to side. And here is just a simple video of walking into a room where it's hanging in daylight, and you can see the color changes on the pieces. So it's really important to me to have work that is interactive and moves, and it encourages the viewer to move around it. And basically, it's just an indication of my philosophy, or an example of depending on one's perspective, one's perceptions change. Thank you.
All right. I'm very pleased to welcome Peter Lipsitt, who is a Massachusetts native and continues to live and work in the Boston area as well. He received his bachelor's degree from Brandeis University in 1961 and went on to earn another bachelor's degree in fine art from Yale University in 1962, where he also earned an MFA in 1965. Peter is a founding member of the Boston Sculptors Gallery and has displayed his work in many solo and group exhibitions across the country. He's taught at Wheaton College and was a visiting professor at his alma mater, Brandeis University. His work is featured in major collections, including the de Cordova Museum, the Fort Lauderdale Museum, the Boston Public Library, the Rose Museum at Brandeis University, and now our own collection here at the Harvard Art Museums. Please join me in welcoming Peter Lipsitt.
What a nice group we have. So, you know my name now, so I'll go on with the show. Okay, so this is an installation at the first Boston Sculptors Gallery. It was in 1994, and I made several sculptures to make an enclosure, even though at the time I was making them, they seemed to be separate pieces made of wood, as in the foreground on the left, and aluminum and steel, and more aluminum on the other side. and then this horizontal piece on the bottom, which is a combination of wood and steel. I was glad to be able to put all those pieces into a formation that would create a enclosure and allow people to go around each one with their spaces separated out around them. So this is a combination of 3 different eras. The portrait, the imaginary portrait at the top on the right, I did in the 60s, early 60s, and I did a lot of clay sculpture, which was important for my career, I believe, because I still work out of that dominion. And the one on the left, can you recognize some of that on the left? It's in the museum here, but this is an in situ shot of that sculpture called Bypass, and in Marnie's, in her, I think, dining room, but it seems to be on the floor. It should be on a pedestal. But anyway, she wasn't a great housekeeper, maybe. And so this thing on the bottom here, Marnie commissioned me to make the portrait of a column. And it seemed classical and appropriate to give as a parting gift to the director of the gallery, James Cuno, in, I think, 1984. I'm not sure. And so that's a bronze piece. It's about 12 or 14 inches tall, and the announcement was used to, acquaint people with the work. So on the left, a lot of my time was spent trying to figure out how I went from clay sculpture to metal sculpture. And you can see it has some quality of clay on the left. You could, if you squinted, you might see it as a possible clay. And the other one on the right is also steel, and it shows how it's attached to the wall with these bars in the back. And that's because I created it on the wall of the studio at the Piano Factory in Boston. And the work stayed there because that's where I made it. And there was no reason to take it off until I had to show it somewhere, which I did. However, what I see in making sculptures like this is the kind of drawing exercise where you start on the wall or on the paper and you put down something, and then, wait a minute, then you do something else, and then another thing and another thing, and maybe you subtract some things because you're able to be additive and subtractive in this process, just like clay. Even though the works are welded, you can cut them right off and start over. I'm sorry the view on the right is not so good, but it gives you a sense of how it's made against a brick wall where it, stood for a long time. Okay, so these are 2 markers, or some people call them towers. They're 12 feet tall. The one on the left is brass, and it's welded brass. The one on the right is steel, and that was the first one. And I know that steel is as tough as it's supposed to be. It deteriorates if you've ever seen any rusted tin cans. So I made it more permanent with brass, and then put some nice patinas on it. It's situated in Boston City Hall, where it's been exhibited on the atrium floor, the 8th or 9th floor of Boston City Hall. If you have questions, you can ask. This is Buttercup. It is in the Harvard-owned building, the Haynes collection, in the atrium. And then on the right, it shows me in snapshots helping to install the work on the wall, which is about 15 feet above the floor. This is painted steel. It was actually commissioned. It was commissioned by, not specifically Ken Moffat, but I think that Heinz bought it. The Heinz building that was there purchased it, and it's still there today if you go over to the Harvard Square Post Office and go across the street. Okay. And this is a larger sculpture, stainless steel, hanging in a skating rink called Badge-Co Skating Rink. It's, as I say, quite long, maybe 30 feet long, and it was the biggest thing I'd ever made. It was commissioned by the city of Boston to go there. And I just wanted to show you a smaller piece down below, which is stainless, and it reminds me of Caro in some ways, but not everything that I do does. This one, in general, the edges you see of my work are not volumetric, especially, are not filled in. But when I first started sculpture in clay, I made voluminous sculptures of models at Peter Grippy's sculpture studio at Brandeis. He and I were a good, back and forth companions in terms of learning from him. And he had very strong ideas, but I moved away from those like many students do. And I think he didn't like what I was doing. And but I had to do it. I was already at Yale by the time he helped me to get there. And I went on from there. And I'll tell you more about that. So that's, I think, pretty much what to say about this. Okay, so this is an installation shot. The paper sculptures on the wall on the left, and one of the papers is on the right, the big black and white one. So those are made from printmaking on paper. And I know what I'm doing when I'm doing the printmaking on paper that's going to become sculpture, but it, it's going to go through many different permutations in the course of the work of it. So all of these are held together, not with glue, but with copper, not thumbtacks, but rivets, copper rivets that I made. And so all the pieces are, in black ink, and then the white of the paper shows through. This one is a figurative one, and I can go into that later maybe, but a lot of my work is basically figurative in every way, but it's abstracted so that the work isn't immediately recognizable as the figure that it becomes. Then down in the lower right are 4 images, large monotypes that come from the same exhibition. In fact, you can see the same one in the left picture. So these are sculptural, I feel. I think the reason I work with black and white is because of sculpture. And I enjoy poking holes figuratively through the prints. I don't actually make holes, but I tried to do that with the white of the paper, which is so beautiful. Okay. Now, a word about beauty. a lot of art is what you would call beauty, and you know what it is. And the best art can be beautiful. You know, there's in the museum here, there's a Henry Moore that I was looking at, and it's beautiful. It's abstract, but bronze. And so I like to delve deeper than surface beauty and want to, I want to keep the image kind of a mystery. Partly because I know what it is becoming, but on the other hand, I break a little bit and try to resist the urge to make it recognizable so that people can look at it and say something that I don't even know they're going to say about it. Oh, that looks like an airplane, or something like that. So you don't need to, give too much attention. The lower right is a bronze sculpture. It's about 14 to 16 feet tall, no, inches tall, and it's like it's clay, and therefore a lot of clay that I do is rubbed and worked out flat in a boiling pan. And then when the clay, I'm sorry, I meant wax. Wax melts, it melts in the pan, and then it gets dried up, and you can use it just like cardboard or paper or anything like that. You can put it together and then use a torch to warm the pieces together. So that's in 4 pieces made one at a time. The bronze piece on the right. That was sand cast. There was a sand casting, if you know about that. One on the left was also sand cast. It was made at a foundry, and it has a patina to make it look green, and then another one at the top. So I think they remind people of things, whatever they may be. Okay, now. Did I do something? No, we have to go back. Oh, are we too late? Can't we go to that last one? Just very briefly. Oh, yeah. Oh, next one. Okay, so the lower left is from Vassar College. They bought it through the bequest of Mrs. Decknatel, who was a friend of Marnie. So that's permanently in their garden outside the museum. The upper ones, one is in a cemetery, the one that looks like a Japanese screen, and the one on the left is in my yard. And that was called, the left one, the title has the word shrine in it. It's about 9 feet tall. So it had a kind of a humorous title. This lower right one is wood, and it's an enclosure like some of my work, and it has an opening, a small opening that a child can go through and get into the interior. Okay. Okay, so these are all ceramic, and the upper one is painted. The lower one is partly painted, and this is my Santa Claus's backyard on the right. Those are all the pieces that kind of getting ready for prime time. Some of them I've finished, and some of them are going to be finished, but I like the landscape that it created. This one on the left is a sculpture with a wire or a rope coming out of it so that it seems like it could be tied up. It's quite big. It's about 18, 19 inches tall and solid. So that's a volume, one of the few volumes. Next. That's it. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. I am going to start us off with a question and see where it takes us. And I welcome your questions as they come up as well. So the Solomons, as we learned, were collecting contemporary art in the 1970s and 80s. And you've, in your various presentations, have given us a taste of your trajectories. But I'd love to ask you to sort of place yourself in that moment and tell us about where you were, what you were doing in that sort of late 1970s, 80s moment.
Who are you asking first?
All of you. We can start with Karen.
I was, much to my surprise, in the 70s, chief curator at what is now the Art Gallery of Alberta in Canada, having come from having had a Fulbright in Rome, never having been further north than Stowe, Vermont, or further west than Chicago. So it was quite a learning experience. Fortunately, I had a big travel budget, and so I was moving around a lot as a rookie curator. And by 78, I was living in Toronto and freelancing, which was much closer to home, which I could get to New York more often, and which is one of the reasons I was in Boston more. So in the 1982, Anthony Caro founded something which still exists called Triangle, which was intended as a one-time only kind of master class for working artists. Triangle because it consisted of Americans, Canadians, and British artists in upstate New York. Oh yes, there we are. That's the first year. And it was supposed to be once only. Well, we still exist. We have a residency program in Brooklyn, and I'm still involved because I think if I had dropped out, Tony would come and haunt me, but that's another story. So there's a lot of overlap between the Boston artists, Triangle art. Marge and Peter were both at Triangle, and Rona was at Triangle, Jill Nathanson, Jelaine Jones, people I showed you. I'm not sure if Jerry Webster was. I missed 1 year, so I'm not all that up on it. So it's this kind of rather incestuous overlap. And then Ken Moffat founded a kind of visiting critics group, which would invite people to come to Boston studios, taken around by a woman he was obsessed with, which made it a little difficult. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And immersion in the Boston art scene. So I was back and forth a lot.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And when did you meet Ken?
Must have been in the early 70s when I was a rookie curator. Mm-hmm. And I know the first show I saw that he did was the Bush show. When I knew Jack Bush's work, I knew Jack, and that show was just so powerful. I mean, I can still see paintings that were in that show. Yeah.
I'm just going to jump to Marjorie, and what were you up to in that period? You were at the museum school.
Yes. Well, even before the museum school, I saw these exhibitions at the museum, Boston Museum, and I saw the Jack Bush show and Friedel Zubas show, Alitsky shows, and I became very, and a huge Morris Louis and Unfurled with all this white space in the middle that just blew me away. And so I became really influenced by that, and also Helen Frankenthal's work. I knew that it wasn't the right approach to begin from there, because the other trends were, or I would say other ideas in conceptual art and pop art and so forth were being pursued, and it seemed a little backwards perhaps at the time for me to be influenced by these things, but I just decided this was a great starting point for me. One thing I didn't mention when I gave my talk is, as a young child, I couldn't use or see things with both eyes at the time. So I could see sunlight streaming in through my window as a very small child, and see it hit different objects with one eye, and then with the other eye saw other things. This, really influenced my work. So it sort of encouraged me to make work that's interactive, that creates a sense of movement, to have people move around it. So I tried to do that, but in the beginning, that's where the layering came in, and trying to increase the layering and using the iridescent paints. But I found that as a starting point, it was really very influential and inspirational for me to see these works being exhibited. And I also made trips to New York, where I also saw Litsky and Nolan shows.
And how did you meet Ken Moffitt?
Well, as a recipient of a traveling fellowship as a 50th student from the museum school, my works with the other recipients were hanging in the museum. And I decided to make an appointment to see him, very scary for me. And he really welcomed me, and he said he noticed the paintings, he liked them very much, and he would like to come to the studio to see more, which he did. And then on another occasion, I told him that I would be having a solo show in Boston, so he said he would come. And actually, he came and hung the show, which was quite extraordinary. And then that's when he purchased a work for the show. But we
do anything that you wouldn't have done, the hanging?
No, actually, it was I thought an idea. He picked 5 very large paintings. They were very tall verticals. And it was a very high ceiling gallery in Boston's Fort Point Channel area, a loft building with 22-foot ceilings. And he just put 5 paintings in that space, which was a generous space. And I thought that, wow, what a great idea, It wasn't cluttered, and you could really experience each painting in it by itself. So that was, it's very helpful. And then he introduced me to a lot of other artists. Artists from New York came to visit. He brought them to the studio. Artists from Canada, artists from upstate, artists from England, and artists from Paris. So I got to meet a lot of people, and then invited me to go and look at studios in Toronto, which he was doing with Clement Greenberg and Karen Wilkin. So I got to meet them as well at that time.
Is that how you met Karen?
Yes, at that time in Toronto at the art fair. Yes.
And then a triangle.
And then of course the triangle, because I was told about triangle by Friedel Zubas, and I was.
Friedel was an artist in residence at Triangle.
Not at that time though.
No, but after.
It was Darby Bannard, yes. And so I experienced this the most amazing time at Triangle, meeting artists from various countries and seeing how they worked and being inspired by the energy, just amazing artistic energy during this period of time at that workshop. And meeting Anthony Carroll for the first time, who is a very wonderful, supportive, and generous artist to many other artists. And it also influenced my approach. And a lot of the artists were using the new polymer gels that I hadn't begun using yet. And I started to at Triangle, and then I continued afterwards.
Yeah, and I was going to introduce Triangle with this slide, which shows the work on on your left, is a work called Red Sail, for which we have a receipt in the Solomons Museum. And so we were very confused about why the green painting on the right, which is what was in the collection, would be called Red Sail. And once we finally met Marge, she kindly explained that they had traded one piece for the other about a year or so after purchasing the original one. And I was going to ask you, what happened between the two of these? Because the one on the left is oil on paper, yes. And the one on the right, and quite flat, beautiful, like flat layering of oil color. And the one on the right, as you may have already seen, as you will see, is just really voluminous impasto application of acrylic paint on canvas.
What happened at Triangle was that the Golden's paint people came and gave us paint. And they were all coming up with new things and would, in those days, I mean, I remember helping unload stuff from a station wagon for somebody's studio in New York. You know, you did what you had to do. And this was a new kind of gel. Somebody had said, well, I really like this, but I wish it were opaque.
Yeah.
Larry Poons had an idea that they should make a time release color so that you didn't have to be there. And Golden's was still very responsive to artists' requests. Artists call them up and say, I like what I'm using, but I want it to do this.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Marge, I know that
Yes, they
you
did.
created a special.
Yeah, I wanted the gel to be a little more liquid, so they invented a more liquidy gel that they called Minkin's gel for a while. But they did that with many artists. They really developed the fluid, high-intensity color, fluid paints for Jules Litsky, who was using a spray gun. And now I think I mostly use those colors. It's much easier, and they're wonderful. And
if you're ever in New Berlin, New York, which is not exactly easy to get to, visiting the factory is one of the most amazing things you can do.
Wonderful. Yeah, which the Golden Factory.
Golden Factory, yeah.
yeah, no, I won't say it. Oh,
I'm just going to point out for the sake of our audience, this is a group shot of the participants in the inaugural Triangle Workshop, and Marjorie is right above me, actually, in the red shirt, in the top row. And I should say, Peter, you attended Triangle as well in 86, which was the year Karen wasn't there. I think Michael Fried was the visiting critic then. And actually, there's you on the right. And Karen, you were wondering if Gerald Webster attended. He did the same year as Peter. And so, Peter, I wonder if you could tell us about your experience and if it was as transformative as it was for Marjorie, or what that was like. I'm going to move on to some photographs of your work from that period.
I just want to say that my process, it has a certain uniqueness to it from my point of view. And maybe it's the way other artists work too, but I deal with kind of tuning into myself. I'm not a yogi or a person who can meditate very well, but I can sort of get into my work very deeply and sort of make it not completely automatic, because there's a objective stuff that I bring to the work, but they're all different elements. The quality of the ink, if it's printmaking, or the quality of my supplies for plaster work, and the various other materials that I pull together, and then so I take it all together and use it at the time that I'm working. And what comes out, I don't always know, but it has a little bit of objective truth, as well as intuition, part of it. And the intuition I value a lot.
And at a Triangle, you were working in steel, in
yes.
construction,
Oh, that's
welded.
Yeah, that's a steel piece. Where is it now?
I can speak a little bit to the workshop experience. 2 weeks, everyone said, oh, that's not enough time. By the end of the second week, everyone was begging for mercy and saying, I couldn't have done this for another week. Formula is very simple. The idea of Tony was to combat the loneliness of the studio and put artists in contact with each other. The studio spaces are individual but open. Nobody has a door that they can shut. And we housed the artists, we fed the artists, we gave them workspace. they had to pay their own bar bills. We're not stupid. And
I left
people
out
just,
the photos with all of the,
Oh,
the
yeah.
get-togethers.
and people just worked all the time. And it was just incredibly intense. There was an enormous amount of exchange. People, as Marge says, with materials, here, try this. Why don't you use a sponge? I remember somebody bringing, Larry Poons was not working at that point. He was contemplating. And somebody brought a bowl of paint with 2 different colors in it and said, here, Larry, try this. And he said, if we could only make paintings that looked as good as the paint. So there was that kind of thing going on all the time. Life drawing at night sometimes. Just this manic work all the time. A lot of dancing, a lot of drinking. We had 1 triangle divorce and I think 2 triangle marriages.
And Karen, you're describing this intense working process. What was the role of the visiting critic in this?
Well, I went
space?
around every day walked around the studios, talked not to everybody every day. I mean, I learned an immense amount from that. Having to engage with the work, coming sometimes with artists I knew absolutely nothing about. I mean, originally everybody kind of knew each other, shared an aesthetic, became increasingly various. By year 2, we had a South African artist, very distinguished, David Koloane, who's now a major, dead now, but a major figure in South Africa, a French sculptor. We have now had, over the years, artists from every continent except Antarctica. And one of the British artists took part in a program of the British Antarctic Survey where they send an artist to Antarctica. So that counts. So it's this, I don't know, this kind of amoeba-like thing. And artists have been so stimulated by it that they've gone back to where they come from and start their own versions of it. So if you go to the Triangle Arts Association website, it's like this, I don't know, tentacles everywhere. It's now mostly a residency program in Brooklyn, but we're keeping the Caro legacy alive because the artists find it so stimulating. But I used to have to, suddenly, I don't know anything about Sri Lankan art, nor did I have much language in common, but somehow I had to come up with some response to this. It was a wonderful learning experience.
And I asked that question about the role of the critic to you, but I also want to ask Marge and Peter, what is the role of that response that Karen is talking about, the response of the critic? It's something that was integrated into this program. And also integrated into the Boston Painters and Sculptors group that you and Peter were a part of in the early 1980s here in Boston. I'm just trying to get to a photo of that. That also involved visiting critics and in fact was all about talking with artists together in a studio. And so if you could just speak to that, that connection and that response.
For the most part, the people who came were other artists, or we had critiques and suggestions from artists. When I was there, Michael Fried, I think, was there, and Shirley Geerling, who is Tony's husband, wife. Shirley Geerling. She was the wife of Tony Carroll. Yeah. They're both gone now, and so everybody was gung-ho to talk about everybody. They would descend in groups onto a studio space and give crits or say what they liked or didn't like.
And did that influence what you did?
Sure, sure, in some way, but I probably changed it back.
Yeah. And Marjorie, I want to make sure you have a chance to answer because I know Clement Greenberg had some advice for you that you did not take.
Oh, yes. Well, I loved hearing, people's responses. I think you really learned from them.
you don't take them all. I mean, if suggestions. I remember at one time Clement Greenberg said, you know, I really like this work, but don't work with plastics, which I then sort of ignored, absolutely. But then at the end of his life, the very end, he was asked by someone, you know, about works, and he thought that I was doing very original work, and that was Lexan work that he was pointing to. So, you know, I think I love getting the responses. I like hearing what the critics say, but then you just have to see what you relate to, you know, what means something to you.
There's no right answer. I mean, if I'm, even with artists that I have a long studio relationship with, I'm just giving my response. It's not a directive. And even Greenberg's writings, which are often said are, you know, very authoritarian, there's a tacit, in my experience, in my opinion, before any of them. He's not prescriptive, he's descriptive.
In the early writings.
Well, there are no late writings, really.
I have so many other questions, but we are very nearly at the end of our time, and I just want to open it up for a brief moment to anyone in the audience with a burning question before we go upstairs to look at the exhibition and Marjorie and Peter's works. Yeah.
I'd just like to say that this was just very informative and very enlightening to me. I'm a painter. I came to the Boston area in '80, and I knew, of course, of Kenworth Moffat, but I had no idea the extent of his influence. Oh, I'm sorry. And how active Kenworth was amongst the artists. And I really feel this almost sadness that it doesn't seem we have that today. It's a much larger art scene. I don't feel the connection between Boston artists and New York as much and the rest of the world. I'm sure there's so many more residencies that do involve the artists, but I think the studio program that you're talking about was a really special time, and I just found it very fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more? Okay, well, I would like to thank all of you for coming. Please, thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.